To give the viewer the best overview of the railroad activity of the Westfield, Massachusetts area, we thought that first a flyover would be best.
The railroad industry in Westfield, Massachusetts, on the east side of town, and head west. To the left of center, we see Little George's Restaurant down below, which is located near the West Springfield city line. Directly below, you can see the CSX double-track main line, and just to the left of the tracks is US Route 20 West. To the left of the highway is the Westfield River, which is flowing towards us. Up ahead on the right is the Lane Quarry. Notice the two spur tracks to the right of the main line. To service the quarry, hopper cars are pushed up the hill onto both tracks, usually during the night. As the cars are filled with aggregate by a giant payloader, the cars are rolled down the hill, eliminating the need for a tending engine to push them. The trap rock is ideal for railroad roadbed support as well as for the highways. The long conveyor carries the crushed trap rock from the mine to the loading area. The quarry also supplies crushed aggregate for road paving and provides larger rock pieces for erosion control. Our pilot now is circled around and has us lined up for a quick view of the conveyor belt that supplies the trap rock for the hundreds of railroad hopper cars that leave the Lane Quarry every week. We're following the conveyor north. This quarry employs between 20 and 50 workers, and its revenues are between $10 and $20 million a year. Lane is one of CSX's 18 suppliers of railroad ballast in CSX's 23,000-mile system. Up on the left are the maintenance buildings. There is also a bituminous concrete plant on this tract of land. It appears to me that this place is about 4 miles long. This quarry began in 1890 when John S. Lane was employed by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. He had the foresight to see that railroads were going to need quality ballast to support their tracks. It has grown into a huge industry. Okay, we're back heading west on the CSX line. Coming up on the right is the Westfield Youth Service Center, which is essentially a jail for kids. On the left is a trailer park. On the left again we see Batera Auto Dealership. After that, on the left is the big parking lot of Walmart. How are we doing on fuel, Scotty? Okay, thanks. Route 20 bears off to the left and the tracks pass through a cut, then fly over Union Street. The Boston to Albany corridor began with an 1830 charter for a 9-mile railroad that ran from Boston to Newton. The line imported 3 crude Stephenson steam locomotives, or engines rather, imported from England. By 1835, the tracks had expanded to Worcester. In 1867, the Boston and Worcester Railroad merged with the Western Railroad, forming the Boston and Albany Railroad. In 1900, the New York Central leased the Boston and Albany and started to paint over the B&A logos, but due to public outcry, they stopped the painting and continued with the B&A paint scheme until 1951. Here's an automobile graveyard on the left. The line operated under Conrail until railroad mergers brought CSX on as the railroad operator in 1998. Salt City on the right is the next customer for CSX. Salt City distributes winter highway melting salt to regional highway departments. During the winter months, lines of trucks are filled and weighed on the truck scales. Most of the salt comes from the salt mines in New York State. The siding trackage was recently improved with larger radius curves to halt derailments. In the warmer weather, the rail cars are pushed into the yard by CSX, where the employees unload them and form them into the mountains of salt. A Boise Cascade building materials distribution center comes into view on the right. Lumber, particle board, plywood, long-length lumber, and shingles are imported here for distribution. After the Boise Cascade is Eastwood Carriers Warehouse, which is a large multi-use warehouse shipping and storage complex. On the left of these tracks was an old Boston and Albany freight house and dock where I worked as a 14-year-old boy. Boxcars of 70-pound bags of Portland cement would need to be unloaded onto two-wheel trucks and wheeled onto O'Connor Lumber Yard trucks. My first summer was 50 cents an hour, and the second summer I got 75 cents an hour. The double track crosses the Depot Square Viaduct, and the Westfield Railroad Station is just on the other side to the right. Beyond the station on the right, we see the main spur track that links CSX with the short line Pioneer Valley Railroad. Let's pan to the right now, Scotty, to get a quick picture of the Pioneer Valley Railroad Westfield facility. We're almost directly over the Pachasik Street Bridge that rises over the south end of their yard, and we're panning toward the north. We'll come back to this yard in a minute, but first let's finish following the east-west CSX line. Okay, we're back heading west along the CSX main line, which generally follows the Westfield River on the left. Lots of small gardens and farms have taken advantage of the fertile floodplain of the river. About 2 miles west of the Westfield station, the double track narrows to a single track. There are block signals that guard the high-speed switch, and you'll be able to see a small signal building between the switch and the road. It will be another 3 miles to the Russell, Massachusetts town line near the base of Mount Tekoa. The next passing track isn't for another 15 miles in Chester, Massachusetts. There is a small siding in Huntington, but not really long enough to let full trains pass one another. You'll see Tekoa Golf Course on the left across the river. Now we'll zoom down to the high-speed switch that changes the double track into a single track. Notice the small building on the right next to the switch that houses signal controls. It looks like there's a rail fan there waiting for a train. It is difficult to spot the block signals from this angle, but you can see by their shadows on the ground. The single track is much less expensive to maintain, of course, and it also enables wider radius turns as the tracks snake their way up the valley.
Position on the hall 9, Eagle Flight 4428. Tower, 10 degrees, Eagle 4 left.
George Washington Whistler was born in 1800, went to West Point, and became a civil engineer. Canals were thought to be the modern carrier of freight in the early 1800s, so Whistler, as a young man, was involved with canal projects, including the Middlesex Canal in Lowell, Massachusetts. When it was seen that railroads could replace the canals, Whistler turned his talents to railroads. The Western Railroad was formed to find a route from Springfield west through the Berkshires. They hired Whistler in 1836, who in 4 years laid out the railroad route to Pittsfield. To the right, you can see Lane's sand and gravel operation, and you can also see the CSX line disappear into the valley ahead. Scotty, can you take us back to the Westfield station now?
The underpass viaduct you see ahead, of course, was not always there. By 1890, there were so many trains in Westfield that traffic on Elm Street was blocked much of the time, causing many complaints. In 1896, a plan was drawn up to dig out the area under the tracks to allow traffic to flow underneath the railroad. The area was paved with durable cobblestones. This solution worked for about 40 years until the tractor-trailer lobbies started raising the height of trucks. The underpass was not high enough. Hundreds of trucks over the years were damaged or destroyed by failure to avoid the underpass. As a school bus driver, several times a year, the news would come over the two-way radio that a tractor-trailer had become wedged under the underpass, thus disrupting our bus routes and everything else in town. Some people would groan, some people would smile. Finally, after decades of traffic problems in Westfield, a comprehensive plan began to eliminate the transportation problem. The railroad viaduct was raised at least 5 feet, a second matching bridge across the river was constructed, utilities were moved, and extensive traffic routing modifications were built. One of the challenges for the engineers was how to keep the trains moving during construction of the new viaduct. Here you can see how initially one track was kept operational while work proceeded on the other. There were compromises that had to be made as well. The plan eliminated forever the revitalization possibility of the Pioneer Valley Railroad line south of the river. That railroad right-of-way was generously donated by Pioneer Valley Railroad to the city for possible use as a bikeway. The tracked diamond, where the railroads crossed for over a century, was eliminated, and trackage, grades, curves, and signals were re-engineered. Before we move on to the north-south rail line in Westfield, I would like to show you this old 1914 postcard that shows a westbound train pulling into the Westfield station. The picture shows the interlocking switch tower that guards the diamond where the New Haven Railroad crosses the Boston and Albany Railroad. We see the semaphore arm signals for both railroads. Now we notice what looks like pipes in the lower right of the picture. These are actually mechanical rods that go out to operate the switches and semaphore signals in the area through a system of bell crank linkage. The switchmaster or telegraph operator in the tower would pull on the various long levers depending on where he wanted to direct the train. The levers were color-coded to aid the tower man to throw the correct switches, similar to the ones shown in this clip. Next, the right-hand arrow shows what I believe to be a telephone call box to get permission to cross the Boston and Albany main line. The large lower box to the left might have contained tools. Both boxes were there for many years. And of course, you can see the baggage handling wagons in the next picture. Another postcard from an earlier day, probably around 1900, shows a steam train at the Westfield station again. It appears that there are a couple of guys in front of the engine trying to fix something. Maybe the train was pulling out of the station and broke some piston linkage as it crossed the New Haven Railroad diamond. It could be the conductor standing in the background, wondering when his train will get rolling again. While these guys work on the engine, we'll pan to the left. We see the platform in the background that connects the Boston and Albany station with the New Haven station. The tender that has come into view is connected to a New Haven switcher. As we pan out, we notice the crude semaphores. They appear to me to be made from wood. I don't see any linkage for the tower master to remotely throw the switches either. I hope they get their engine fixed soon so they can be on their way to their stops in Russell, Huntington, and Chester. Here is an August 1947 picture of a New York Central engine taken by George E. Vortuva. These engines were called Mohawks. Here is number 3002 pulling a Chicago-bound train called the Knickerbocker across the New Haven Diamond in Westfield. Notice the more modern lighted semaphores and switch linkage. The strange post with hooks in front of the switch tower is for picking up post office mail on the fly. There was a similar post across on the other side of the tracks. Notice that a wooden platform has been constructed between the tracks. The large flat metal panels on the front of these engines were installed to deflect smoke up higher, away from the engineer's eyes. At about the time this photograph was taken, my mother took my brother and I on a railroad trip to Fulton, New York, to visit Aunt Florence and Aunt Edna. My aunts worked at the Nestle chocolate bar factory in Fulton, so we were on our best behavior. To a little boy, the noise and steam and huge drive wheels of this engine pulling into the Westfield station were very impressionable. My dad knew the telegraph operator, Gum Dillon. He took me up into the tower to visit him a couple of times. I was amazed at the view of the tracks from the vantage point of his desk. The telegraph key on his desk clicked rapidly, and until I learned Morse code myself, the clicking device was baffling to me. An old man I met one time told me that he had signed up to take a New Haven Railroad excursion train to see the Yankees-Boston Red Sox game in New York City. There were several passenger cars of fans that had boarded the southbound train at the Westfield New Haven Railroad station. As the train waited to cross the Boston and Albany main line, the engineer got the signal from the tower to cross. The train started to move across the diamond but stopped and quickly was put into reverse. A Boston and Albany train roared across the diamond, nearly hitting the excursion train. The man in the switch tower had made a terrible mistake. Luckily, the excursion train engineer had seen the other train coming. He secured his engine and went up the stairs to the switch tower office and found the man to be drunk. He chewed the man out. One day in about 1980, after a snowstorm, my son and I lucked out by meeting the snowplow from West Springfield Yard, clearing the tracks. I think the guy in the caboose was staying warm with the help from a bottle of amber fluid. He certainly was happy. I wonder where they would turn the plow around for the trip back. Maybe in Pittsfield? Passenger trains no longer stop here, but busy railroad activity exists on the Pioneer Valley Railroad network that serves industry north of Westfield. This area will be covered in the Railroads of Westfield, Massachusetts Part 2, which will appear soon. Watch for it.
8.